you guys for coming. I think we should get started. My name is Jamie Sundsbak, and I think this is BioAM, because I'm sure it says so, but this is our first BioAM in the PM. We've been in a group for about the last 6 months. We've been focused on sort of creating a bio-business culture here in Rochester. And tonight maybe we'll discuss what that actually means in our little groups that we'll have after our speaker. And we've always done it traditionally in the mornings. It was based on what's called an open coffee club, which was started in Boulder, Colorado, focused around technology. I decided to kind of bring it here and refocus it around healthcare IT, biotechs, things like that we could be building or supporting here in the city. And I had a couple people saying, you know, I'd love to come to these events, but there's two things holding me back. One, I got to take my kids to school in the morning, and it's really tough for me to get there. And two is we don't have any beer. That's just not going to work in the morning. So this is the first time I can actually hold a beer at a BioAM. So I'd like to present Dr. Nelson Stokin, who I don't know how I met through Jim at CFI. And Jim said, you have to meet my friend Nelson. He's awesome. And I started to dig a little because I'm always Google stalking people. And
okay, that's creepy.
Yeah, and I stalked you very heavily, and I was amazed at your criminal record.
We didn't have to bring that
up. Nelson has had an amazing career. He could tell us probably a little bit more about it. And also is an author of a book, which I was going to actually buy and have here, but I got lazy and forgot. I'm sorry. And he has been, I guess your official title is what at Center for Innovation?
I don't know what my title is.
Guy who shows up to CFI or something. But he helps out the Center for Innovation primarily with the educational curriculum that they're developing around innovation. Because we wanted to have our first event in the night focused on kind of transitioning from just a group that sits down and meets to more of a culture of what we call doers, we thought who better to invite than Nelson to talk about how we can kind of spur that process in the group here. And then we'll proceed to do some activities, and then hopefully we can come up with some great ideas that will help change the future of Rochester. So without further ado, I'll eat my pizza and Nelson can talk.
Yeah.
And I'll take the ball with me. Can I take the ball with?
You can take the ball. Thank you. Well, thanks for having me. Just a little bit of background so I think you'll understand the perspective that I'm going to bring. Is I've worked at Honeywell for 10 years and then worked at Medtronic for 12. So I've been at the Center for Innovation for about a year now as a consultant. Worked in technology. But I think the perspective that I'm going to try to instill in you is the fact that in technology, one of the key missing components is actually the human side of it. So I don't have a technology background. I have a PhD in child psychology. And one of the things that I'm going to share a bit in the short time I have to just set up the more active part is just to give you some thoughts on how, if Rochester is going to change, how so much of this in my mind is about culture and it's about how individuals think about Rochester being different. So I'm going to draw on literature out there of business books that I particularly like. I'm going to talk particularly about a book called Switch by Dan and Chip Heath. Chip Heath is a cognitive psychologist at Stanford. And I'm going to draw on a book by Matthew May. Matthew May was an expert on the Toyota production system, so he wrote the Elegant Solution many years ago on Toyota. But in recent years, he's been particularly interested in how design and the psychology side of things affects how well you do things. So the book that I'm going to draw on today as well is called the book, The Laws of Subtraction. In there he talks about how in business as well as in your life, there's principles you can follow that makes things work better. Let's put it this way, I read business books and my wife and my kids joke about the fact that I'm like a business book savant, so I don't read literature, I read business books for fun. But my wife actually read this book, so now we're in the midst of kids leaving, and our challenge is now the laws of subtraction are working so well, we're starting to get rid of stuff that the other person didn't know that the other person got rid of, and we didn't like it. So it's a really good book I think I would suggest to read because it really gives you some sense of how in our really crazy lives, subtraction is actually maybe one of the ways we can be more effective. So those are the two general books. I'm going to tell you a bunch of stories. So AJ's going to like this. Charles Mayo, everyone's seen this Charles Mayo quote, but I think it's really important to think about is the fact that change is a permanent state, and I think in these days it's really difficult to keep track because things happen so fast. So one of the things that I think is going to be important as Rochester looks at about how they're going to be in the future. You're going to have to look at how you're going to manage change, is it culturally as well as individuals, and that's what I'm going to get into. It's a small group, so as we go through this, feel free to pop in with questions. So one of the things that Jamie has as objective tonight is really thinking about how do we create an entrepreneurial community in Rochester. And so there's a lot of things going on around the country. So everyone always points to Silicon Valley, but there's things in Kansas City, there's things in Texas. I mean, Google's putting wire everywhere. So there's a lot of different places in the country as well as around the world where they're really embracing the fact that you've got to innovate. So a great book, how many of you ever heard of the book called Startup Nation? Startup Nation is a very good book. It's about the culture and why Israel is such a hotbed of innovation. I really highly recommend you read it because it talks about how Israel is an innovative culture, but they talk about these sort of macro social things, like since everyone has to be in the military, that's how people get jobs. It's very different than in the US, where if you go to the business world and go to the right schools, and then people go into the military, and then there's a siloing, and that's why there's all these programs now, if you think of trying to get military people to get jobs. In Israel, that's the way you get jobs. So in there, they talk about the fact that it's because of the way their culture is set up. So it's a really good book to read because it really kind of talks about the systemic social things that leads to their country being very innovative. So we're going to talk about tonight a lot of the different things about what are some of the things we can think about as we try to look at how Rochester can be a place of innovation. So the book Switch. There's a lot of academic ways of talking about change. The book Switch does a very good job in my mind about simplifying it so that you can keep it in your mind. The book Switch basically talks about cognitive, social, psychological research on change and basically puts it down to 3 factors: the rider, the elephant, and the path. So the path is you got to know where you're going. So you got to figure out what's the destination. In there they talk about the rider and the elephant though. The rider is the analytical side of our brain. It's the rational side, right? So it's like, okay, I know I should lose weight, or I know I should do X. I should quit to have this bad habit. Why is it that so often, even if we know, we don't do? And in this book, they really peel it away really nicely. And the metaphor is that it's because of the elephant. The elephant is our emotional side. And you got to figure out a way to encourage the elephant, otherwise change oftentimes doesn't happen, even if rationally we know we should do something. So here's an example from the book that I thought was very interesting. They talk about people's finances. So this guy basically wrote this book that probably is on late 19 or something, and he basically talked about how he got out of debt. And what he did is he actually fed the elephant. Because what he said is, he said, when I was trying to get rid of debt, the logical financial thing to do is to start trying to pay down the balance that's the highest. I mean, the balance that has the highest interest rate. And he said, you know what happened is, I always gave up. Because if you're in the situation where the highest interest rate balance is also the largest balance, guess what happens? You keep trying to do it every month after month. You're throwing a bunch of money at it, and you never see it go down because it's the largest one. So what he did is he did the exact opposite. He said, I'm going to basically not care about interest rates, and I'm going to order it by the size of the balance, smallest to the largest, because then every time, if I do it that way, pretty quickly I start seeing a bank account loan disappearing. I don't care about the interest rate. That is actually a simple example of he fed his elephant because the emotional side of him had to get some satisfaction. So that's one other thing. So as I talk about this thing, as I talk about some of these concepts, just keep in mind the rider, the elephant, and the path. Because even in the situation that we're talking about, we could have the best plan to do destination medical or transform this place, but if we don't understand stakeholders' elephants and figure out ways to figure out how do we basically feed each of these key stakeholders for what's in it for me, it's going to be very difficult to make transformation. So Louis Pasteur talks about chance favors the prepared mind. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about from these different books and other books some basic concepts of how you can think about how you can make yourself as well as your organizations more effective. So here's the questions, and we're going to talk about these in detail once I'm done with my talk, where you're going to basically get a chance to deal with these questions. So one of the things I want to start with is the concept of cognitive biases. Anyone heard of cognitive biases? Okay. So cognitive biases, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize in Economics a while back, and all of their work was in social psychology, and it was around the fact that humans are actually not as rational as you think. So if you think about basic things, like they studied like people that, statisticians that fall into the trap of when they're crazy about sports. Oh well, that person had a great rookie year, so they're going to fall into this. They're going to have the sophomore slump. Well, as a statistician, you should know that the sophomore slump is just statistical, right? If you have a really good one, the odds are you're going to basically go to the mean the next time. But they studied all these people and realized that people start to fall into these traps because of emotion. So when you ask people, well, is it more likely to die in a plane crash or die in a car accident? Even now, people tend to say the more dramatic. It's probably more likely the airplane crash. And a lot of these things are because people essentially drive emotion into their decision making, so they're not rational. So I'm going to talk about some of the ways we can try to avoid this. So there's a really good book. How many of you read the book by Clayton Christensen and a couple other authors called The Innovator's DNA? Good book to read. Innovator's DNA was written by Clayton Christensen, who's a Harvard professor, and two other people. And in there, they basically talked to entrepreneurs and tried to understand what are the key aspects of them that make them successful. So they talked to Jeff Bezos at Amazon. They analyzed Steve Jobs. Mark Benioff, who started Salesforce.com, and they looked at all these people and they tried to sort it out. What they came to the conclusion around is that there's these 5 characteristics. It's about observing, experimenting, networking, I always forget one, and associational thinking. The key one I want to talk about tonight is associational thinking. One of the things about entrepreneurs is they actually have more dots to connect. So there's a bunch of books out there, including Jonah Lehrer's book called Imagine, and what they've started to find is that people that are innovative tend to have more dots to connect. They have different experiences. They interact with different people. So they're not essentially in this very small bubble where they only know what they know. They always are continually trying to expand their horizons. So for example, when you take creativity tests, people that have traveled a lot actually do better on creativity tests because they just have had more experiences. So associational thinking is one of the things that's important. And for example, gatherings like here, or the Cube, things like that are all actually very important foundations to create the culture that we're trying to achieve, because it helps flow the associational thinking part, so we're not all sitting on our own, and we're basically increasing the diversity of our experiences. So think about that as we'll go through these. Think about your own experiences, things that you could improve on, because a lot of these things I would argue are not just in stone. It's things that you can actually do to improve. So in Switch, one of the things that they talked about when it comes to change is to continually look for bright spots. Bright spots are where things are happening that under the same constraints, people still overcome those constraints and do better. So let me give you the story that's in the book Switch. Gentleman who's a professor gets a sabbatical, he goes to Vietnam, where the infant mortality rate is very high. If you think about that situation, years of billions of dollars from the World Bank and all these other places pouring into it, doing assessments of why are so many kids dying. He's got I think it's a year there, right? So he's not a long-term thing. So he goes there, and one of the things he does is he looks for bright spots. So what does that mean? He goes around and he starts weighing babies in villages. He starts to notice that there are some babies that are not malnourished. And then what he does is he kind of analytically figures out, okay, why are they not malnourished? Is it because they're getting extra food, because they've got relatives in the government or anything? And he essentially takes away all of the variables that could be the reason why their kids are not malnourished. So then he explores and asks the question, what's different? And what he discovers is that the kids in these villages who are not malnourished, their parents are doing things differently than tradition. One thing they're doing is they're actually feeding their infants first. Because typically what happens is that if you're the youngest, you're the lowest on the totem pole, so you oftentimes end up getting less food. Because the parents and then the older kids get to eat first. The other thing that they notice is that these parents are doing other things, like they're adding things to their food. When they're collecting rice, there's a freshwater crab are in the rice paddies. They're adding that to their food. They also have this green that grows next to the rice, which is like a spinach. So it's got a lot of vitamins and help. They're adding that to it. So what he discovers is that the fact that they've changed one cultural tradition of who eats first, and they've also they've added supplements to the food, that's why those kids are not malnourished. So what does he do then? He identifies this bright spot, and he essentially then gets these parents to teach the other villagers how to do the same thing. Because it's simple, it's cheap, it's not that expensive technology solution, right? When he leaves Vietnam, over the course of the next few years, the mortality rate of infants actually goes down significantly, just with the simple thing. So one of the things that I got out of this is the question of, what can we be doing to identify the spots in our community that work and basically learn from it and duplicate it. So it's no different than if you're in companies and you're talking about Lean Sigma or best practices. Not really that different, right? It's not earth-shattering. But oftentimes, I would argue, sometimes what happens is we either ignore it or we actually, because of our own personal needs or our organization needs, we actually want to kill the good ideas because we're threatened, right? So sometimes we deliberately try to take care of it because we don't want people to be better than we are. So again, to me, a lot of times, a lot of these things come back to my child psychology background. Adults, in my opinion, are not that different than kids. In fact, sometimes adults are worse because kids at least are honest. As we get older, we tend to find all kinds of good rationales and complicated scenarios about why we behave badly because we feel bad about it. Kids just do things and they say it like it is. So that's one of the things I want to leave with is what are the bright spots and what can we do to actually enhance those bright spots and duplicate them. Okay, sometimes big problems can be solved with small solutions. Another natural bias we have is that if there's a big problem that we perceive, we believe that we need to spend a lot of money and do a lot of things to fix it. I mean, you think about big things like malnutrition or violence in different places. Right? We tend to basically think we got to throw a lot of weight to it. Well, one of the things they talk about in Switch is that oftentimes it's the simple things that matter. So here's another story. In the book, they talk about a small community somewhere in the Midwest. There's like 400 people in this town. The town is dying. Because what's happening is that, like a typical sort of rural community around here, right? There's a bigger town nearby. People are going to the Walmarts and everywhere else, so the downtown is dying. So the store owners can't keep their business up and everything. What happens is this set of high school kids. Again, it's one of those cases where it's probably a high school of 50 or 100 kids at most. They decide that they want to save their town because their view is they're going to go to college and they're going to come back. So what do? Right? They're just high school kids. Right? So what they do first of all is they decide, what we're going to do is we're going to go find the eyesore in our small town. And what they do is they organize a cleanup day and they invite not just the high school kids, they invite grandparents, everyone else. And what they do over a weekend is they clean up the eyesore in town. The ones with the junky cars and everything else. That small thing starts a ripple effect for what happens in this community. So they just basically did this one cleanup day. Then they start doing it in small other ways. Then they ask the community, can you just spend 10% over the next year, 10% of the money that you make and basically feed the stores in our town. So don't buy everything at Walmart or don't buy everything at the big box store. So they get the community agree to that. Within a year, basically what happens is this town goes from clearly looking like it's fading to the stores are starting to flourish again. They get a grant from the state for a few $1 million to do economic development, and over the course of a couple of years, they literally save their town. Small little things that have a huge impact, that oftentimes we naturally think that if there's a big problem, we gotta throw big plans and big bucks at it, but often it's the simple things. And it's the fact that these kids wanted to stay in their town, right? So they probably got grandparents, everyone else, emotionally invested. They started as the town to feed the elephant, and amazing things happen. So less is not more, less can be better. So there's this is from the book The Laws of Subtraction. So one of the things they talk about is so this is Exhibition Road. It's a thoroughfare in London. There's also places in DC, but the original plan for this was by a Dutch urban planner in the Netherlands, near Amsterdam. His concept was, you know what happens is we put so many freaking rules on the roadways, we make all of us dumb. So in other words, you got stop signs, you got everything else. So he has a crazy idea of what we're going to do is we're going to basically build a street and we're going to have no stop signs. We're not even going to differentiate between pedestrian walkways and the road. We're going to take away all the rules, visual rules that tell us where different people need to be, how fast to go, and everything else. So he does that. Guess what happens? Injuries and traffic accidents actually go down by like 85%. The theory is that by putting so many rules and structures around things, we become automatons, in my mind, right? We follow the rules. So in other words, think about how many times are you at a stoplight, and then if you're not paying attention, listening to the radio or whatever, once that sucker turns green, you don't look, you just press the gas because the thing tells me to go. So what they found is that because of all these rules, and you think about our life, how busy it is, we basically become less observant and less effective, and we just follow the rules like robots. In fact, there have been studies where there's been brownouts in Washington, D.C., into Virginia, and when the lights have all gone out, there's actually less accidents in D.C. than when they have all the traffic stuff. So, how does this relate to what we're talking about? Well, I would argue that part of the challenge and comfort we're going to have is it's very easy when you're looking at something that's as big as what Destination Medical and all these things happening, it's very easy to start putting a whole bunch of structure around it. Now, you need structure. I'm not saying you don't have any structure, but there is a danger that you put so many structures and regulations and layers, you actually make things worse than better. And so as an example, when I do this talk, like I worked at Medtronic, right? I always tell people, it's like, well, think of the quality system we have for the FDA. Every time something goes wrong, we add another procedure. My guess is most people that work in highly regulated industries, no one actually knows what the rules are. Because there's too many of them, and every time something goes wrong, we just add rules. So that's why basically we become stupid and we check the boxes, but we actually are not making things better. So that's one thing to think about as we go forward is are there ways we can be comfortable with the fact that maybe fewer rules might not be a bad thing. So the other one that comes up a lot is, you know what, it's really hard, we don't have enough money. If we had more money, we could do more things. That's another thing that the innovation literature is showing more and more, that actually oftentimes the best innovations happen when you don't have anything. That more money is not the solution. In fact, if you look at Bose Allen and McKinsey, it gets shown over and over again that companies that spend more money in R&D aren't necessarily growing any faster and/or aren't actually more innovative. You certainly need some resources, but oftentimes it actually makes things worse. So let me tell you about a couple examples. So the Mars Pathfinder. In both cases, with the design of the Lexus and the Mars Pathfinder, a 25-year-old with not a lot of experience was actually the one that solved the big, hairy problem. So, Mars Pathfinder, right? You're trying to get this vehicle to land on Mars. NASA was stuck for years trying to figure out how to get it to Mars and how to land it. And what was the big challenge? Everyone that worked at NASA was trying to figure out, how do we land this thing using propulsion? Tough problem, right? So they brought in, this project manager from NASA brings in a 25-year-old, he's just got an undergrad, like they got a master's in engineering, never worked at a space place. So they bring him in. He's the one that transforms how to land the thing, because he starts thinking like wildly crazy ideas. And then he says, well, what if we land the sucker by using like airbags? And we just bounce the thing on the thing, and then we release it. Why don't we do that instead of propulsion? Because propulsion is a lot harder. And that's how the Pathfinder lands, right? Because it gets parachutes in, the airbags deploy, basically bounces around, and then they release it. Not propulsion. Lexus, right? You're trying to do a luxury vehicle using a platform that's economical, but you want styling, you want performance, but you want fuel economy, right? 25-year-old again says, well, you know, I've got a design, right? But part of the challenge is this design could work, but here's the problem. There are actually not certain parts available to do what I'm saying. So what did Lexus do? Toyota actually then basically said, well, that could actually work. So they actually created new parts that any other vehicle created to basically get all those requirements met. Initially, it looked like the requirements were conflicting. Again, that's where bringing in people with a different mindset that hasn't been doing the same thing over and over again. Oftentimes what happens is the expert's not the one that's going to give you the innovation, because they grew up in that certain mindset of how you do things. So, you guys have any questions so far? Another challenge we face with any of these things is a lot of the things that we're going to be trying down here, my guess is we need to be comfortable with just trying stuff and getting it wrong. Right? So let me tell you about Pixar. So Pixar every Tuesday morning has a meeting where essentially what happens is people come in with their ideas, and for like 4 hours, people's ideas are just ripped into, just torn into. But one rule: criticize, but you got it's not a but, it's an and. You criticize, but you gotta have a solution for how do you fix it. But every Tuesday morning they go through this, and the reason that John Lasseter said that, as well as when Steve Jobs was alive, they said they did this because what they didn't want to do was, if you give people too much time, they start to polish it. And as they polish it, every time they polish it, it becomes more personal. Because now it's my baby, it's my solution. And I'm gonna make it really pretty, and until it's perfect, I'm not gonna present it. What they talk about at Pixar is, that's great that you do that. Here's the problem. You could have a very finely tuned, finely polished idea that sucks. But it's pretty. It's just really bad, right? So that's the mindset they have. So let me give you a couple examples. When they were doing Finding Nemo, 9 months away from release of Finding Nemo, they were busy doing Bug's Life at the same time. Michael Eisner. So remember, Michael Eisner and Steve Jobs do not get along. Right? So Michael Eisner comes in to screen Finding Nemo 9 months before Finding Nemo is released. Goes in, he sees it, he comes out of it, and he says, you know what? Pixar's lost its touch. This confirms what I already believed. We're not going to renew the contract with Pixar. Guess what, though? He didn't understand that even if it was 9 months away, every Tuesday they were ripping into Finding Nemo, and when it got released, it was a hit. And that probably was one of the main reasons Michael Eisner got kicked out of Disney, and Robert Iger took over. Because he didn't understand that that's the way Pixar worked. Toy Story 2. They're making Toy Story 2. They're less than a year away from releasing Toy Story 2. They screen it. They watch it. At this time, Steve Jobs was still alive. They watch getting close to final cut here, right? They watch the movie and they come out of it and they look at each other and say, this movie stinks. So what did they do? 9 months or so away from Toy Story 2 release, they basically say, we're going to start all over. So they start all over, redo the entire storyline, redo all the graphics, and still release the movie on time, and it's a hit. It's a matter of the fact that they're really willing to accept the fact that if it's not good, it's not good. But more importantly, at the front end, they're really open to the fact that we are going to try some things. It's going to be messy. We may get it wrong, but it's worth the experimentation, right? In fact, I was reading last night in Forbes. I just got my Forbes magazine, and they were talking about innovation. And they talked about Jeff Bezos, and he said one of the things at Amazon, he says, he said, I encourage our employees to go down blind alleys and experiment. So one of the things about Amazon is actually is known for being really cheap. So they don't have a lot of money. But he talks about, I encourage our employees to go down blind alleys and experiment. Try to create tools to reduce the cost of doing experiments. If you can increase the number of experiments you try from 100 to 1,000, you dramatically increase the number of innovations you produce. So what Amazon does is they systemically in their culture are constantly encouraging people to try stuff out and get it wrong, but just keep experimenting.
So just keep swimming, basically?
Yeah. Okay, so last slide. Yep, last slide. Then it's going to be up to you guys. So the other piece that they talk about in a lot of this literature on innovation is that the concept of the lone genius and the aha moment is actually a fallacy. That so many of the great inventions have happened over time. So in Stephen Johnson's book, Where Good Ideas Come From, he talks about the fact that like Charles Darwin and all these people, if you look at it, a lot of their ideas took 20, 30 years to finally evolve to where the aha moment appears. That it's just a slow percolation. They take notes, they keep working at it. So it actually takes a long time. The other piece that they talk about is that the lone inventor thing is not the way it's not the way that innovation happens. A lot of it is around, like Jim said, random bumping into each other, right? So Stephen Johnson calls it the liquid network. You want to get into as many liquid networks as you can where you're bumping into people. So let me give another story. These two gentlemen won the Nobel Prize in physics. So they were trying to study the origins of the Big Bang. They kept studying it. They get into this place where they say, doggone it, something's wrong. Because when you look at the data, there's all this noise. Something's got to be wrong. So they come to the conclusion that their telescope is broken, which would be a bad thing if you're trying to do this research for many years. So one of the gentlemen goes to a conference related, but not directly related to their field. It's an astronomy conference. But he has lunch. He bumps randomly into a person and has lunch with them. This person who doesn't have the same expertise as him, he's explaining the problem and everything, and he goes, you know, what if what you think is noise is actually a signal? How would that change things? They go back, they reanalyze the data, and they realize that what they thought was actually interference and noise is actually data that shows that the Big Bang had happened. And then they win the Nobel Prize. So the point is that it's about the liquid network. It's about forming communities where people are bumping into each other. For example, they talk about Silicon Valley. Everyone talks about that place. There's been studies on why that community has always tended to have this success. And one of the things that they discovered is that when social scientists have done research in social networks and things like that, is that the cultural norm there is that you always share. So for example, if you think about going out there, people will move jobs every 2-3 years. They'll go from Facebook to Google or anything. But they continue to talk, go to bars, sit down, talk shop, and not say, you know what, I can't talk about that because that's proprietary. They have a culture where, yeah, they do have limits, but in general, the general culture is to share because you want to learn from each other. In fact, they've done studies of different cities. They did this quarter in Boston. And what they found is that Boston had a great deal of innovation going on, but then when the general data and the digital equipments came up, the one thing that killed that area for innovation was they lost that ability. Because then when those corporations got big, They put all of these rules around proprietary nature, can't share, you can't talk to each other. If you leave the company, we're going to go after you because of non-disclosure, right? The fact that they did those things actually is what killed their innovation. Where Silicon Valley still has a tradition of sharing to a great extent. So that's what that research is. So with that, I'm going to pause. Any questions? Because I'm going to stop talking and then having you guys are going to start doing it.